You're not going to walk in there and say, I'm taking another guy. But there's, you know, nowadays, and I said, no, in my license.
Okay, our next presentation is from Concordia. All right. Hi, everyone. Going to be switching gears a little bit here. Quite literally, our last few presentations have been about space. And I'm going to be talking about some work I did over the summer with my advisor, Thelma, for magnetic characterization of Fe2O3 polymorphs. So just as an outline, I'm going to be giving you some overview about iron oxides in general, then talk a little bit about our samples, how they're unique, and then, of course, go through the results of the research that we had. All right, so
yeah, that's fine. Click on that.
There we go. It's still on my screen.
That's fine. As well as it.
Perfect. All right, so iron and oxygen are two of the most highly prevalent elements on Earth in our atmosphere. So these iron oxides are really in nearly every form of nature that we find, nearly every environment, super prevalent, which means that understanding these, knowing what they are, and being able to characterize certain geological samples has a lot of application for fields like archaeology, geophysics, even there's applications to medicine where you can take some iron oxide, specific iron oxide that's friendly to the body. You can move it around using a magnetic field, and then there's certain applications for drug delivery in that way, or even cancerous cell destruction. There's also applications for things like planetary science. I guess polymorph specifically that we were the most curious about with this research has been hypothesized to be one of the major, polymorphs on the Martian surface. So there's applications like that, which makes studying iron oxides, really important for a whole bunch of different fields. And I guess if that's not enough, in the words of Thelma, Earth's surface is a giant laboratory, and we want to learn more about that. So the Fe2O3 polymorphs that we're looking at are the gamma phase, which is megamite. After certain thermal treatments or naturally on Earth, after the application of energy, our gamma is going to transform ultimately to the alpha phase. That's the most stable form of Fe2O3. So obviously that's what it's going to transition into. We have two intermediate phases there, though, that are rather rare. We don't find them in nature a whole lot. We have our beta phase, and then we also have the epsilon phase. The epsilon phase was primarily what we were looking to find in our research. Spoiler alert, we did. So there's a few differences specifically in the magnetic properties of these polymorphs. For example, gamma and the epsilon phase are going to be ferrimagnetic, which means that there's going to be a net magnetic moment, but it's going to be weakened as there's going to be some spin moments in the atoms that are aligned one way and spin moments that are aligned the other way, but they're not ultimately negating each other. So we still are going to have some magnetic moment. The beta phase and the alpha phase are both antiferromagnetic. Oh, I said that wrong. The beta phase and the alpha phase are antiferromagnetic, and that's where we have the two different spin moments, but we still have magnetism. The gamma and the epsilon phase are ferrimagnetic, and that means that there's going to be, I guess, a stronger permanent magnetic moment for those polymorphs. All right, so our samples were made a few years back, before COVID actually, and it was a process outlined in paper Muller at all. And basically it just takes some silicon material. We put some iron inside there, heat it up, cook it. It's another fun term that we like to use around the lab. And then we dissolve the silicon and we're left with just the Fe2O3 particles. And then those samples were annealed, another fancy word for cooked, in an air environment in the lab. We did several different temperatures that aren't listed here for different time durations, but these were the main ones that we looked at and found the best results for. So how do we analyze our samples? Well, one of the primary tools we use is Mossbauer spectroscopy. And the benefit of this is it can tell us what specific phases of Fe2O3 are in our samples. Just as a little overview of Mossbauer, it's going to have, there's a radioactive source on the far left. There's a housing for it, and that radioactive source moves back and forth. The type of radiation, it's a gamma emitting radioactive source, and that's going to pass through a sample, and then we detect the transmission through the sample. This is one of the most important tools we use. Number one, because it's very specific to iron in general. And until very recently, this is one of the primary tools we had at our disposal at Concordia. We also did some research. We took some measurements here at the University of Minnesota at the IRM using SQUID magnetometry. SQUID, if you don't know, stands for Superconducting Quantum Interference Device Magnetometry. And that's going to give us more of the specific magnetic properties of the samples. We conducted measurements at various temperatures and different magnetic fields. Some of the primary, I guess, results we get from that are hysteresis loops of our samples and then high temperature magnetization curves. And there's a very flattering picture there on the right. So to get into our results, in order to understand those Mossbauer spectra, there's a lot going on, so it helps to break it up a little bit. In the next slide, we'll have our results, but just to give you some better idea of what's going on in there, we're going to have a few different lines. You're going to see our red fitted line, which that's our experimental data with the best fit. The blue line in all of our results is going to represent the alpha phase, that hematite, which is the most stable phase. Then we're going to have the brown, green, and the orange lines, and those are going to represent the epsilon phase. And then the magenta line, that doublet there, is going to represent the beta phase. And all those together kind of looks like a colorful, complicated mess. All right, so here we have the results for different annealing temperatures, and then our two different sample sizes, the large and the small. Well, I guess particle size is a better word. But really what's so important about this is that we can tell from these results that the particle size of our iron changes when the iron transitions at various temperatures. So for example, in this large sample size, we're going to see the epsilon phase start forming at around 900 degrees C, whereas comparing that to the small, we don't see any epsilon phase. And that doesn't emerge until around 1000 degrees C. And we can see also, contrasting that a little bit, the large sample size, the epsilon phase, is disappearing a lot faster than it does for our small samples, small particle size samples. All right, and then the magnetometry results that helps us confirm what Mossbauer tells us originally. So the top two charts there are from our high temperature magnetization experiments. So what happens is we put a sample in the magnetometer, heat it up, and then we allow it to cool back down. And during this time, we're measuring the magnetic properties of that sample. And what's really helpful with this high temperature magnetization experimentation is it allows us to detect the transition temperatures of different samples. So for our epsilon phase, we have a transition temperature at about 495 Kelvin. And if you look here on these charts where those dotted lines are, shows that we have a transition right around that 495 Kelvin temperature range, which proves that we do indeed have the epsilon phase present. And then in terms of particle size, we have our hysteresis loops on the bottom. And if you see on the left is going to be our large sample or large particle size, small is going to be small particle size, obviously. And that corresponds to when we first start seeing the epsilon phase in our samples. And if you look at these two charts, or these two plots, they are a little bit different, but they both show that we have similar composition in terms of phase with both of those two samples at the different temperatures. All right, so just to summarize kind of what we found that our synthetic samples showed a particle size dependence for phase conversion at different temperatures. That's when they're obviously thermally treated in an air environment. If they're not, we don't really know what will happen with that. We also found evidence of the rare epsilon phase and the rare beta phase. And obviously, more so for the epsilon phase, the particle size dependence shows up more. And our results from both magnetometry and Mossbauer support those conclusions. So yeah, thank you for all listening here. I'd like to thank some of the previous people who have worked on this before I was involved in it. I'd like to thank NASA Space Grant for the funds. Yeah, if there's any questions, I can take those.
Questions for our speaker?
I have some.
Go ahead.
Can you show the slides where you have the magnetization versus
Yeah, the bottom one's the history.
the one on the top, actually.
Okay.
So I'm trying to understand the units you have on magnetization, right? Again, it's not my world. Whenever I hear about magnetization or magnetic fields, I hear Gauss or Tesla. How's
Right, so specifically, we are measuring not necessarily the magnetic field, but the magnetic moment of the sample.
Okay.
So there's an external field that's applied, but we're not really measuring the magnetic field that comes from the sample. We're measuring the specific magnetic moments. Okay. So that's what that's going to refer to.
All right.
Could you go back to where you showed the different types, the epsilon and gamma or whatever?
It should be this one.
Are these arrows to indicate that it starts as gamma and it becomes beta and then it becomes epsilon, and then everything goes through all four?
Yes. We have some very limited, we don't find the beta and the epsilon phase very commonly on Earth. So I guess until relatively recently, these beta and these epsilon phases weren't necessarily discovered or thought of. But yes, as we apply more energy to these polymorphs, they will transition to their most stable phase, which is the alpha phase.
And was there a gamma phase in your data? I didn't see.
Well, we don't. If I go back to our Mossbauer, I can't really see it with this on the top. But so our gamma phase is barely present. So if we look at the results before thermal treatment, we see it just a little bit there at the very top, that green line. But you have to take into consideration that when we say before thermal treatment, these samples were still cooked to prepare them. So what I guess a further expansion of this research is to anneal these at lower temperatures for various times and then check them to make sure we do have that gamma phase.
Can I just
clarify
that? Yeah, because we don't find the gamma because it's a metastable phase. So gamma, you kind of move straight to alpha, but we are doing thermal treatment at 600 C, 800 C, and C. if you can detect the gamma there. But it's really difficult to get that phase because it's a metastable.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.